is some nervousness within the Labour Party about turnout in inner London, because it's inner London that, generally speaking, gives Sadiq Khan his greatest support, whereas outer London tends to be more favourable territory for the Conservatives. I would expect, famous last words, Sadiq Khan still to win the mayoralty, but it's possible that Susan Hall will run him close, and it's even possible, I suppose, that she will win. And if that happens, I think we really will see the Conservatives be able to point to a miracle, really, in some ways, which will, I think, distract from what we've said. Returning to the point we made at the beginning, is a pretty terrible night for the Tories.
So more election results expected later today, and then some even tomorrow. We will keep bringing them to you here, of course, on Times Radio, the election station. Many councils in England still to declare. We'll find out who's won mayoral contests today, including in London and the West Midlands. But it has been pretty bleak so far for the Conservatives. Down almost 500 council seats. They lost, of course, the Blackpool South by-election to Labour, with the third highest vote swing since the Second World War. But the Times is reporting that the Prime Minister has kept his head above water, with fractious colleagues backing off, at least for now. Has he done enough to lead his party into a general election? Let's ask Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Morning to you, Tim.
Good morning.
Is this as bad as you expected for the Conservatives?
I think it is. I think they've done a pretty good spin job, talking about Ben Houchen an awful lot yesterday afternoon, but it can't really excuse the fact that this has been a terrible night and probably will be a terrible weekend for the Conservatives. Certainly they look like losing around 500 seats, which was at the most pessimistic end of the projections. We'll have to see what happens in London, obviously, if they pull off a miraculous win there, and we'll have to see what happens in the West Midlands, so they can point to those as well. But if you look at what happened in many council seats, and you look at what happened particularly in Blackpool South, you'd have to say it was a bad night for Rishi Sunak.
I mean, the Conservatives, as you rightly say, are desperately trying to jump on the Ben Houchen victory to say, look, this is all right. And if Labour can't win in the Tees Valley, they can't win in a general election. But this is a man who didn't even wear his Conservative rosette as he stepped up on stage. He did very much distance himself from the party, didn't he? Saying, I'm the local man who's worked for you over the last few years. Think about me and not the party I represent.
Yeah, and Andy Street in the West Midlands will do the same. Also, if you look, and not to get too nerdy, at the swing against...
do.
Well, if you look at the swing against Ben Houchen in Tees Valley, that would actually, if reproduced in the general election, bring a whole swathe of seats in that area to Labour anyway. So the fact that one person has won one mayoralty contest isn't really as important as the numbers. And if you dig down into them, it doesn't look good for the Conservatives in the North East. Just as obviously it looks pretty terrible for the Conservatives in Blackpool South as well. So I think sometimes, we get very focused on the numbers of seats that have been lost and individual contests. But actually, if you look at the swings against the Conservative Party, they are in quite a lot of trouble. And Labour, for all the fact that the projections at the moment suggest that they're only 9 points ahead of the Conservatives, also managed to win seats where they need to win seats. Whatever the Telegraph says this morning, I don't quite understand that headline. You have to look at Labour performance in places like Redditch, like Swindon, other places where they hope to flip sometimes marginal seats. Milton Keynes is another one, and they've won there. So although I think people are talking down Labour's performance yesterday, I don't think we ought to be too down on Keir Starmer and the Labour Party.
Although, interestingly, when you look at the figures, I mean, the Conservatives lost currently, and there's still 5 councils who have to declare, 448 seats. But Labour have only picked up 173. The others have gone to, independents, to Green, to resident associations, to the Lib Dems. Labour does have some problems, not least the so-called Gaza problem. It happened in Oldham, other seats as well. Traditional voters with big Muslim communities unhappy with Labour's initial stance on Gaza, and that has cost them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And certainly, Labour can't afford to ignore this problem completely. But it has to be said, sounding rather cynical, that those voters are normally concentrated in seats where Labour has very, very big majorities. And it would take really an earthquake for them to flip to another party at a general election. So although Labour has to keep an eye on that, and I think certainly it has to keep an eye on Bristol, where the Greens did quite well, and I think they are in contention for a parliamentary seat there. I don't think Labour will be quite as worried as some people think they are right now. It's not great news for them, but it probably is repairable before the general election. And even if they were hit at the general election from those voters, I doubt they would, have problems keeping hold of the seats.
Let's talk about mayors, because, of course, there were 3 new mayors, all of whom went to Labour, which is really interesting, and probably most embarrassingly for Rishi Sunak, York and North Yorkshire, which is in his own backyard.
Yes, and this is a good illustration in some ways of the point we were making earlier. If you look, for example, at the East Midlands mayoralty, this new mayoralty that was created, that contains a swathe of seats that Labour will be looking to win at the general election. And again, Labour performed pretty well there if you look at the result. York's and North York, and in, I think, less promising territory for Labour in a general election, but it's certainly a bit embarrassing, obviously, for Rishi Sunak to lose that one.
Why are there new mayoralties in certain areas? Because some people were getting in touch yesterday, particularly from the East Midlands, some of our listeners saying, I don't want a mayor. We don't need a mayor. It's an extra layer here. It's going to cost more money. And quite frankly, there were a few people who got in touch saying they were voting for the one candidate who said that if actually I'm elected, I'm going to abolish this position. So where does it come from? Does it come from a local desire, or is it sort of, put upon an area?
Well, sometimes you see these mayoralties created by referendum. Sometimes you see them created by the councillors involved. I mean, it's part of a trend really towards direct election, because there is a feeling that you can hold councils more accountable if there is one figurehead that you can point to. And it's a trend not just in the UK actually, but also across Europe. So I think whether people like it or not, I'm afraid that probably is going to be the future. Although we have seen, and you'll remember this, in Bristol, a mayoralty created and then actually done away with after a referendum in which people voted to scrap it. So it's not necessarily inevitable, but I think it is a trend.
What about the Lib Dems? What's their performance been like? I mean, we were talking to pollsters beforehand. They were saying they were likely to gain around 100 seats. Currently, they've gained 101. But is it enough at a time when there's such dissatisfaction with the Conservatives generally? Would you have expected the Lib Dems to pick up more?
I mean, I think, they performed to about expectations. I mean, I think if you look at the projected share of the national vote, they're, about 3% down where they, wanted to be. They do seem to have picked up seats, however, where they need to, like the Labour Party in some ways. So I think what we've also seen possibly, and we'll have to crunch the numbers a little bit more to check this, but we have seen, I think, some tactical voting in the sense that, Labour Party supporters giving their vote to the Lib Dems where they look more likely to win and vice versa. So I don't think it's a great night for the Lib Dems, but I certainly don't think, it's an absolute stinker for them by any means.
Guide us through what you're particularly looking out for today.
Well, I think we will have to look at London. We will have to look at the West Midlands. I think the West Midlands will probably be the most interesting one because, of course, there are a lot of parliamentary seats in that particular area, which traditionally help decide general elections. So I think if anyone's looking, for an interesting result, look at the West Midlands. But once again, I would urge people, even if Andy Street manages to win that contest, and as you say, if he wins, it'll be partly because he's distanced himself from the government and from Rishi Sunak. Look at the swing against him. So even if he wins, look at the swing and see what that might mean for the parliamentary seats contained within that area.
And what about London Mayor's going to be quite interesting as well, isn't it? Because for a long time it was felt that Sadiq Khan was going to not necessarily easily, but retain his role as London Mayor. But it's interesting, since the polling's closed, there's been some discussion about how the Conservative candidate, Susan Hall, could well have closed the gap, and not least because of the change in the voting system.
Yes, I mean, to be honest, it was quite a deliberate change. I think there was always the feeling that the previous voting system favoured Sadiq Khan because he would get the second preferences of Liberal Democrats and Greens. That's not true this time around. It's a plurality system once again. I think there is some nervousness within the Labour Party about turnout in inner London, because it's inner London that, generally speaking, gives Sadiq Khan his greatest support, whereas outer London tends to be more favourable territory for the Conservatives. I would expect, famous last words, Sadiq Khan still to win the mayoralty, but it's possible that Susan Hall will run him close, and it's even possible, I suppose, that she will win. And if that happens, I think we really will see the Conservatives be able to point to a miracle, really, in some ways, which will, I think, distract from what we've said. Returning to the point we made at the beginning, is a pretty terrible night for the Tories.
Tim Bale, thank you for your time this morning. He's Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London.